Hello and welcome back to this damnful idealistic crusade. In this video I'll be discussing and reviewing the Warner Archive Blu-ray of the US 1943 release version of Journey into Fear. Now this is the third of the three Mercury films made at RKO in the early 1940s. It is of course the sister film to Citizen Kane and the Magnificent Ambersons, but unlike those two masterpieces of the medium, Journey into Fear never gets discussed. It's often regarded as a footnote at best, and most people have never seen it, let alone even heard of it. And that's because it's been simply unavailable on home video since the early 1990s, and the Archive Blu-ray is the first major release since then and is thankfully a brand new 4K preservation scan. But of course, the story doesn't stop there, as there is a secondary alternate version of the film floating around, and if you thought The Magnificent Ambersons was the Mercury film that had the most convoluted post-production history and was the most compromised and is still the holy grail of all film archivaldom in terms of trying to find the original 131 or so minute version that Wells had made and intended before it was butchered by RKO into the 88-minute release version, complete with reshoots and a changed ending, then you would be wrong, because Journey into Fear had the exact same problems, and in ways it's more compromised than Ambersons was. Journey into Fear is of course adapting the 1940 Eric Ambler thriller of the same name, and follows the adventures of one Howard Graham, played in the film by Joseph Cotten, who is an American munitions expert who's been working in Turkey and is just trying to go back home. But as he's been working for the Turkish forces to help improve their fortifications against the Germans and other powers, if he was to, say, be removed from the equation, that would set back the Turkish forces for at least some time until a replacement could come out and get everything back up to speed. It would basically give the German forces breathing room to attack, or at least have some advantage over their enemies. And so Howard Graham, who is a complete normal guy who has not really a heroic bone in his body, who's very focused on his job and likes his job and is very much uncomfortable in the rest of the real world around him. He has to be drawn out of his shell. Suddenly there are people or forces trying to kill him, primarily in the form of Banat the assassin, who is in the pay of Mueller, a German Nazi agent. And so what began as a simple night out with the company's man in Turkey, Kopiken, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, played wonderfully by Everett Sloane, and another of the iconic Mercury faces popping up in this film. What starts out as a trip to a sort of underground nightclub to watch a magic act and be introduced to the Dolores Del Rio character of Josette, and setting up an interesting subplot of potential infidelity, because Howard Graham is a married man. His wife, played by Ruth Warrick, returning from Citizen Kane, is also a very simple-minded, straight-laced character who wouldn't understand any of this. So she's pretty much kept out of the picture. But anyway, in this nightclub, he witnesses an interesting magic act, and an attempt is made on his life. So this thrusts him into a completely different world of treachery and deceit where no one can be trusted, and our hero is not a hero at all. He just wants to be able to get home. He doesn't like what's going on. He doesn't know what to do because he's a normal guy. And so he's a little bit stuffy. He's a little bit anti-heroic. And this is a primary aspect of the film, trying to be non-traditional. It's actually replicating a lot of what Ambler put in his novel, his cynical but humorous worldview, because the Wells character of Colonel Hackey determines that the best thing for Howard Graham to get back to the States, hopefully not dead, is to not take the train, but to put him on a slow-moving tramp steamer, which is filled with a variety of quirky characters of different nationalities and backgrounds. So most of the film and the story takes place on this rickety tramp steamer, and Howard Graham is increasingly wary of his surroundings. So he has to go from day to day on this ship voyage surrounded by these strange, quirky characters, some of whom are played by returning Mercury faces. There's Richard Bennett, who played the Major in Magnificent Ambersons as the ship's captain. There's the legendary Agnes Moorehead playing the wife of a socialist character played by Frank Readick, who was, of course, part of the Mercury radio group, and most famously to us Shadow fans was the primary voice of the radio Shadow, and in terms of doing the iconic introduction that was retained even for the Orson Welles years in terms of when he did the famous early years of what we think of in the Shadow on radio in terms of the primary Shadow series. It's also interesting to note that all the characters on board interact with each other or have dislike of each other based on their nationalities, and this being already in the war years based on a novel that had been published near the start of World War II, you've got all of these international tensions being maintained on board this ship where everybody's in close proximity to one another. So when Howard makes friends with the friendly German archaeologist professor on board, played by Eustace Wyatt, that causes other characters to think less of him. So there's a bit of an internal social drama that's going on as Howard Graham continually feels like the weight is off of his shoulders a little bit because he feels like he can relax, but then certain elements come into play and events transpire that show that indeed the forces that are trying to kill him may have made it onto the ship, and anyone around him could be a secret Nazi agent with orders to kill him. And if that were not enough, as the ship makes its journey, it takes on an additional passenger who is, of course, Banat, the assassin from the opening. So this becomes a complete Hitchcockian thriller, and I use that term because that's what most people regard this film as being in a Hitchcock vein, and indeed it was thought of for being purchased in terms of the story rights originally to be made as a Hitchcock film. It could have easily been, as Hitchcock liked Ambler, and Joan Harrison, his producing partner, had read the novel and eventually actually later married Eric Ambler, and the whole story setup is very much the innocent man or the average man caught up in things that are far beyond him, which was a common trope that you found in Ambler's works, and it's all through the Hitchcock wrongman thrillers. So you could easily see this film being made in the early 1940s around Hitchcock working at RKO doing, of course, Suspicion. He actually basically wound up doing Suspicion instead of Journey into Fear, or you could see him making this film instead of Saboteur, but of course that was when he was already over at Universal. But you can very much see how this has Hitchcock sensibilities because the film still has an incredible undercurrent of humor. It is quite funny throughout, but in a macabre black humor way. And this is replicating a lot of what's in Ambler's novel. That's what makes it feel quite lived in as a story. But you also have to look at the atmosphere that's generated. And this isn't just the production design and the set design of the ship, which is immaculate, but it's also getting into the lighting, cinematography, and camera angles. The film was photographed by the legendary Carl Struce, who had an incredibly prolific career going back to the silent days, and most famously shot the masterpiece Sunrise for F.W. Murnau, and would also go on to make other absolute masterpieces, like the 1931 Ruben Mamoulian pre-code version of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, with its incredible photography. So Struce was a perfect person to bring into the realm of the Mercury unit and photograph this film, so it's filled with deep shadows, elements that are similar and echo what Greg Toland did with his masterful deep focus photography on Citizen Kane. So it's basically another legendary cinematographer working within the Mercury realm. So visually, not only do you have incredible atmosphere that manages to evoke the spirit of other places, even though it's not leaving the RKO lot, but it is within elements of the Mercury style. So frequently there are visuals that as I term it, it looks like Citizen Kane goes to thriller land. And that's, of course, because Orson Welles was heavily involved in the production. He was only acting in it, but he co-wrote the film with Joseph Cotten, and there were contributions from others as well. But the original credits were actually for the screenplay by Welles and Cotten, adapting Ambler's novel. But Welles worked a lot on the pre-production. His fingerprints are all over the film. And unfortunately, this has led to the common misconception, if people actually know the film, that Welles probably directed the film himself. That is not true, but he certainly helped develop certain lighting setups or certain angles or suggested things, as the Mercury unit was very much a collaborative effort, regardless of what level you were in the production. This is most exemplified in the film by, I think, one of the most amusing bits of casting in film history. The silent killer, the assassin Banat, who menaces Howard Graham through the whole film and is just an incredible presence, but in a very low-key, sort of average-looking way, very much with the inherent sort of macabre humor and quiet, chilling, normal-looking killer that you would expect from a Hitchcock film. Well, the actor playing that part, who doesn't have any dialogue, is the film's producer, Jack Moss. So Welles actually cast his producing partner in the film, and Moss actually does incredibly well. He's fantastic as this assassin or would-be assassin. So Journey into Fear still has that can-do attitude because it's a Mercury film through and through. This was intended to be the sort of proof that they could make a more commercially oriented movie that would be successful, that wasn't arty like Citizen Kane was viewed as, and it wasn't going to be as depressing or a period piece like Magnificent Ambersons was. This was to be the third film that proved they could make something that was contemporary and could strike a chord with audiences. Plus, it was, also a wartime film and adapting a novel that had been well received that was also a contemporary novel. Now, the myth about Welles directing the film isn't true because he was also still working on Ambersons, because the two films, Journey into Fear and Magnificent Ambersons, were actually tied together by RKO in terms of they had to share a budget and it had to be under a certain amount. And crucially, they had renegotiated Welles' famous contract from the original version on Citizen Kane that gave him autonomy and final cut as long as they agreed on the subject matter and it stayed within a certain budget parameter. Unfortunately, for the other two films, the contract was changed and Welles no longer had that level of clout and that protection, and that's why the other two films were not protected in the way that Kane was. And thus, RKO was able to do whatever they wished with them, and that's exactly what they did. Now, the smartest thing that Welles and the Mercury unit did was in selecting the director of the film, who did direct the film, and that needs to be understood. The whole notion and urban legend that Orson Welles ghost directed the film, and the good stuff in the film is the stuff that Welles did, and anything that isn't or is average or boring or weird was the other guy who got the credit. That is absolute BS, to be honest, because what Welles and the Mercury unit did was hire the best director of B thrillers and adventure spy thrillers in all of Hollywood. They hired Norman Foster, who had started as an actor, who had world travel experience. He was a writer, he could work on music, he could do everything, and he was a brilliant director because he had done most of the fantastic Mr. Moto films over at Fox, all starring Peter Lorre, all set in exotic foreign locales with incredible atmosphere, being able to generate a feeling of being in another world practically, going everywhere from the Far East to deep Africa to the back streets of Cairo, or out on a desert trek and never leaving the Fox lot, and achieving miracles with minuscule budgets and ridiculously short, grueling schedules. The Mr. Moto films that Foster made, he also wrote or co-wrote. They are the work of an auteur, and everything you see in those is reflected in Journey into Fear. So Foster brought all of his talents for making spy thrillers, and again, I will say that in terms of the classic Hollywood era of B films and thrillers of the 30s and 40s and the heyday of the studio system, outside of Hitchcock coming to America and making some more of his Wrong Men thrillers that were stemming from the original sort of conception he had done with the 39 Steps back in the UK, Norman Foster was making the best spy thrillers that anybody did, and I think they're just about the best spy or action films that, classic Hollywood ever produced. They are phenomenal for what they are, and so he brings all of that into the Mercury unit. So you've got this incredible fusion of Norman Foster's incredible talent for generating atmosphere and intrigue on minuscule budgets, achieving miracles with nothing in very short schedules. And so he's brought into the Mercury world. So that's why you've got flourishes that feel right out of Citizen Kane. You've got a lot of the Mercury players. You've got the Mercury can-do, let's challenge the status quo energy, but it's fused with somebody who knew how the studio system worked and knew how to get the best out of nothing or extremely minuscule elements, and was experienced at making exotic spy thrillers. Crucially, Foster was a collaborator with everyone. He enjoyed the experience. He had actually been working on Wells's It's All True project. He was doing the My Friend Benito sequence, which Wells loved the footage of so much that he actually brought him on to direct Journey into Fear. That was really what brought him into the Mercury realm. And of course, Wells was still making It's All True and had gone down to Brazil, and so you had him basically working on all these different projects, and Ambersons was in various stages of development and production and being finished, and he's shooting his scenes for Journey into Fear, and he's in Brazil, and the communications were horrible, and then various misconceptions spread around, and the studio just became tired of the whole affair because basically the Mercury unit didn't do things normally or in any sort of average way, and they were just viewed as being difficult and being a thorn in everyone's side. And then there was a regime change in terms of the studio leadership, and basically a lot of things got piled up against the Mercury unit, and a lot of various grudges, most of which were not really deserved and based on urban legends even then and various bits of gossip. So it became a very troubled production, but not because of anything the actual production did. But it has to be stressed that part of what makes the film great is that Norman Foster brought all of his know-how and experience into the film, and his stamp is all over it, just like Wells and the Mercury unit stamp is all over it. So it's a wonderful fusion of the two, and it shows that somebody could come from the outside into the Mercury unit and operate freely and be a collaborator, and Foster even helped work on the screenplay and made writing contributions. So what you have is a film that should have been well received and should have been a classic in its own right, and while it may have not been reaching the heights of Citizen Kane and the Magnificent Ambersons, it wasn't really designed to. It was designed to be the Mercury film that could connect with audiences more directly and prove they could be successful so they could continue making pictures for RKO. Unfortunately, we didn't get that film. We didn't get the film they were making, and over the process of making the film, they did make tweaks and changes, and in particular, they did struggle a bit with trying to come up with a satisfactory ending. And there was a lot of back and forth with the studio, and then they started having to do test screenings. And the test screenings did not go well because the film was purposefully trying to be a bit different. You have a lead character who is purposely anti-heroic. The film has a mixture of black macabre humor and a great deal of cynicism about the world in terms of its worldview. It's got a whole bunch of quirky characters who are very different from one another and very different from your typical supporting cast of characters in a Hollywood studio film. You've got elements that are very much outside of the production code. In particular, the not heroic lead character having a sort of flirtation with another woman when he's actually a married man. So that was 2 strikes against the lead character, and the test audiences didn't like that Joseph Cotten's performance was modulated to perfectly play this character. They didn't like that he never got that sort of traditional resolve of steel somewhere down beneath himself. He never truly started acting like a hero anywhere. When I've described the film to people, I liken it to what if Cary Grant's Roger Thornhill in the opening of North by Northwest, when he's being extremely fussy and he's not really grasping the situation that he's found himself in, being mistaken for a non-existent foreign agent. Over the next couple of reels, Thornhill starts to throw himself into the mystery because he's got to not just clear his name, but stay alive. Well, in Journey into Fear, the Howard Graham character, in terms of how he is in the book and how he was originally in the film, is more like Roger Thornhill if he never changed from the way he was in the opening reel of North by Northwest. Of course, he's much more morose and withdrawn and very, very gloomy, but there's that constant reluctance and a sort of disgruntled flippancy in a way. He doesn't take any of it seriously until he finds himself on the boat and it starts to dawn on him that maybe this is real. And when things start to happen and, some bodies start piling up, then he really starts to sweat it out. Now, the production of Journey into Fear and the release versions and what happened has been shrouded in mystery ever since it came out in 1943. There has not been a lot of information out there, and the film has typically been treated as a footnote because either people write it off as Welles did not actually direct it himself, and so they act like it's not that important, or they just treat it as a sort of B-film curiosity if it gets mentioned at all. What I will say is that we now finally have that backstory and an incredible amount of research in terms of the making and production and release of Journey into Fear and what went wrong and why we have all the different massive cuts in the film in terms of the release version, and the incredible book by Mark Edlitz, Maverick and the Machine, which is newly out. It is an incredible piece of film scholarship, so I cannot stress how important this book is. If you see this film or you want to know about this film, you have to read Maverick and the Machine to actually understand how it came to be, how the release version happened, how the edits happened, how it's tied to both Magnificent Ambersons and It's All True, and how it really became the final nail in the coffin of the Mercury unit at RKO. So in terms of going from the original preview version that they had assembled, which was about 100 minutes, and how you get to what was eventually released in 1943 after multiple delays, you have to basically understand that there were multiple edits done by the studio, not always and frequently without the participation of the Mercury unit and Orson Welles. There were multiple test screenings and then re-edits of the re-edits. There were some reshoots. The Mercury unit and the production got to do some of the reshoots they wanted to do, which were normal reshoots any film would have in terms of getting additional pickup shots and inserts they needed to clarify story elements and things. But it was essentially a post-production that got arrested by this whole process. It was a film that never truly got to get finished. They got to get to that, roughly 100-minute preview version, but they never got to finesse anything because they never got to actually have the post-production they should have had, and it was no fault of their own. The studio began stepping in and interfering as they could, given the second contract that Welles had signed. And after what was going on with Ambersons, I think they felt the test scores reacting negatively to the less commercial or more purposely challenging elements were, it was basically raising some red flags, and they immediately started going, oh no, it's another Welles runaway. And so the film went through a process of recut after recut after test version after test version, reshoots that were implemented. Some were not, others were denied. Then they went back and allowed some other reshoots to be done. They allowed the Mercury unit and Foster and Wells to do a bit more and spend a little bit more money reluctantly. It was basically a constant back and forth. And the whole Mercury unit, and Wells in particular, were very much trying to smooth things over and be cooperative. This wasn't a matter of us versus them and we have to have our way. They clearly understood where the studio was coming from. They did try to make changes and adjustments based on the test preview reactions, and unfortunately, they weren't given the chance to finish the film on their own or to even have all of their suggested changes implemented. And if any of this is starting to sound familiar, there is actually a lot of parallels, not just to what happened to the original version of Magnificent Ambersons, but 15 years later, what happened on Touch of Evil, where Wells famously wrote his 58-page memo begging Universal to not release the film the way they had taken it away and re-edited it, and then Universal implemented some of Wells's requested changes, but then just dumped the film out at the bottom half of a double bill, and that was it. Well, on Journey into Fear, there's correspondence with Wells in the studio, and they did eventually implement some of his requested changes to try and resurrect and fix what he could from the way the studio had edited their own version. And they basically seem to have done this in maybe the first two reels, which is why the opening of the film and the release version is a little bit more cohesive or snappier than the rest of the film. And then they just ignored everything else. A lot of that was because they had already made some different print elements. And in particular, to make things even more convoluted, they had already shipped out or had some versions in circulation of a prior edit, a prior version that's different in picture and sound, and that was floating around Europe. So that is why there is, to this day, a secondary surviving version of the film that's a completely different version in picture and sound, with additional footage that is not in the US release version, but missing footage that was in the US release version, and doesn't have some of the tweaks and audio changes made in the US version, and it's got completely different credits, a completely different opening, and a completely different ending, because again, if this was not complicated enough, there were multiple endings shot, planned, considered, or tried out for the film at various stages. And I knew of some of them, but in Edlitz's research, he basically was able to find that everything indicates that there were not just 2 different endings for the film, but about 7 that were thought of or shot or considered at one time or another. So in terms of the materials for the other endings, including a really tantalizing one with both Wells and Dolores Del Rio, we just simply will never know. Ultimately, RKO released their final release version in 1943, sometime after the film had actually been originally finished with its principal photography. This whole back and forth process and the constant re-edits and changes and back and forth took some time, and they spent more money on it, and frankly, they spent more time and money on it than they would have had they let the Mercury unit actually finish their post-production normally and released a proper version of the film that wasn't enormously compromised. Because the 1943 release version only runs 68 minutes. Now, if you think back to that original preview version being roughly about 100 minutes, that's a gigantic percentage that is gone in terms of runtime alone. And you also have to factor in that the release version had tweaks and changes. It had a new credit sequence that removed Wells's co-writer credit and also tweaked things to make it less of a Mercury-seeming production and more of an RKO-seeming production. If you think it's just a matter of, they just took a bunch of stuff out and butchered the film down in terms of the runtime, no, they went much further than that. Most, if not nearly all, of Joseph Cotten's performance is is significantly altered. They had him go in and redub his performance to try and neutralize the original characterization of Howard Graham as being the ultimate reluctant hero and not really heroic at all, into being a little bit more modulated as a sort of slightly more clear-cut a lead character who was maybe a little bit more heroic, had a little bit more gumption. So the entire lead character, in terms of the tonality, what you're hearing in the release version is frequently different to the visual performance you're seeing in the original performance that was there. And if you look closely, as you can with everything else about the editing of the release version, you can start to spot the seams, because sometimes the voice doesn't exactly match the lips because it's a different performance. It's not just a different line reading, it's a different performance they had Cotten do. Plus, there were inserts and reshoots that were done and spliced into the film and changed, but not all of that was in the control of Mercury, and the studio also removed elements of scenes that were considered too risque or would have been too challenging and stuff the test audiences didn't like. So most of the subplot of Howard's flirtations with Josette on the boat, being a married man, that all goes. And it's not like it's just clearly done. You'll actually have entire sections of scenes that are just yanked out, and you can actually see the footage around those that indicates that stuff is missing. There's even one point where Howard and Josette apparently share a kiss, and that section is gone, and it's just yanked out, and we suddenly have Howard wiping his lip with his back to the camera, and if you scrutinize, you can tell he's wiping the lipstick off his mouth. So, there's stuff like that. There's actual scenes that suddenly just they faded it out prematurely and went to a completely different scene. They reordered scenes, they did all sorts of stuff, and they altered the soundtrack. They also implemented a partial voiceover narration that Cotten reads as Howard Graham. And this is primarily only in the opening of the film, the first reel or two. And in the opening of the film, the narration has to be used as complete exposition because it's there to partially explain the story, because those scenes have been yanked out. So the narration is having to pick up and be expository to fill in the audience on what's going on, but it's not super long or very descriptive narration. You get basically these little bursts, and they seem removed from the film because they were never intended to be there in the first place. This was merely patching that on. It's very striking narration in terms of it has a wonderful eerie quality to it, and it works because you need that information because you don't have it otherwise. But you can't escape how jumbled the film feels. The first time you see Journey into Fear in the 68-minute US release version, you're going to be confused as heck. Most people wind up not even liking the film all that much because they're so confused, because this is one of the most bafflingly edited films in the entire history of the studio system. It's as if somebody had a vendetta against this film and the way that it was chopped to ribbons. It's frequently incomprehensible. On one hand, though, it does increase the level of tension because it makes the audience feel as confused as Howard Graham is, but that's not a good thing if it wasn't intended. It's hard, if not nearly impossible, to follow along with the beats of the story. You have to watch the film multiple times over the years to actually better understand it, and no matter what, it still comes up short because it's only 68 minutes long, and it's such a jumbled mess that you feel like you're not getting the whole story, because guess what? You're not. When you go from 100 minutes down to 68 with a whole bunch of other changes and other things, that's not a good sign to start with. So this is a film that is horrendously compromised, but it's still got flashes of incredible beauty and striking visuals that feel right out of Citizen Kane, and fantastic atmosphere and intrigue, and that Mercury spirit of trying to do something different, even if it's Everett Sloane grinning conspiratorially at Joseph Cotten, dragging him away from his wife to take him to an underground nightclub and maybe get him hooked up with a beautiful woman for the night after a dance sequence they did where Dolores Del Rio is dressed in a leopard costume, which is unfortunately not in the film. It's another thing that was yanked out, but at least we still get the underground nightclub magic act that unfortunately ends in someone getting shot. The US release version is thus a patchwork affair of all sorts of different elements because there's opticals all over for the edits and the fades. The soundtrack went through multiple generations, and I do think that actually harmed what would have been the very intricate Mercury handling of the soundtrack, because all three Mercury films paid intensive focus on the audio with Welles's background in radio, and so all of the music and sound effects were done to an intricate level. Except Journey into Fear, they didn't get to finish it, so the sound mix doesn't feel as intricate as it should be, plus you've got generational loss in picture and sound all over the place. Basically, if you look at any part of the release version of Journey into Fear, and you're an editor or you're a student of film and you know anything about how films are made, you can start to unravel the entire film. If you start pulling on a thread, you can just keep following that, because the film is... it's a giant mixed up puzzle where we will never have all the pieces. That's not to say that the release version doesn't have great things in it, as we do have the revised new ending that Welles, Foster, and everyone came up with, which has a nice bit of interplay between Joseph Cotten and Orson Welles. Of the two endings we have for the film, it's the one that actually works and at least feels fitting as a conclusion. It's a shame they never got to finesse it, or we don't get to see some of the other things they were working on, but of the two surviving endings, it's the only one that actually works. But the other thing, and the most striking thing about the entire film when you see it for the first time, is the opening. And what this is a scene introducing the assassin character of Benoit. It's incredibly atmospheric, and it's actually a pre-title sequence. The film opens cold with this incredible atmospheric, highly dynamic camera visual in terms of the angle and the photography of this seemingly normal-looking, heavier-set man in his glasses in a sort of a dingy hotel room, and it seems like he's packing his suitcase and he's playing his favorite record on the turntable next to him. But then you realize he's actually loading his pistol, and suddenly there's a problem in the audio. And the song is actually skipping because his favorite record has a skip in it, and this becomes the audio identifier that Benoit is near. And this is something you would expect in a Hitchcock film as a darkly humorous but completely chilling signifier of the evil force or the killer being nearby. It's a fantastic device, and this is the opening sequence of the film. It's just this one small little piece. There's no dialogue. But that moment right there is so striking and so challenging to an audience of the 1940s by being so different, but also so lived in. It is evocative of the whole film and everything it was trying to do. It is the perfect opening, and it comes before the titles, which was something that practically no one did at that time in the studio era. It was exceedingly rare for anyone to attempt a pre-title sequence, and it's also really striking because the killer goes out, closes the door, and we go bam into the titles. And in a lot of ways, it's predating the famous door slam into the titles of Goldfinger in 1964. It's a similar conceit, actually. So that is the version of the film that was dumped out in 1943. It ran on multiple double bills, and most people thought it was a B feature because RKO basically took what was an A film and hacked and mutilated it enough and got it down to such a short runtime that they transformed an A film into a B film, which seems bizarre and totally illogical, and it frankly, it is. They so harmed the film that they paid for that it just baffles you all these years later. So the film came and went rather quickly. It did make at least decent enough returns that a 68-minute film on a double feature would have, but because the film was budgeted along with Ambersons and they were having to share numbers, both films were deemed failures, and both were just the further reasoning for kicking out the entire Mercury unit and washing their hands of the entire Orson Welles experience. And this would help to further the gossip and industry legends that surrounded Welles and followed him for his entire career, none of which were true or deserved, as he did just about everything humanly possible for somebody in that situation to make the film they tried to and set out to do, and not compromise it, but work with the studio wherever possible, who was not really wanting to work with them, and unfortunately it just didn't go well for anyone involved. And then the film just fell into obscurity. It didn't get any sort of rediscovery. It typically didn't get included in the Welles retrospectives because Welles was not credited as the director. It was looked at as a B film because it was only 68 minutes, and it's gotten some passing mentions or some sections in Welles biographies, and that's been about it, which hasn't been helped by its lack of availability on physical media. Now, to briefly talk about the alternative European version that was supposedly rediscovered in the 2000s and has been worked on some by I believe it's the Munich Film Archive. They've tried to do a preservation version of that unfortunately low quality source that's been shown at a film festival or two, but that was all the way back in 2015. But what this European version is actually an earlier RKO edit of the film, so it doesn't have the additional changes they made that eventually are reflected in the release version. But this version runs about 71 minutes or so, and it's got anywhere between 5 to about 8 minutes that are unique and not in the US release edit. But again, it's missing things that are in the US release edit, and it's got a different soundtrack, different credits, and a different ending. It also doesn't have the introduction of Banat used as a pre-credit sequence. Instead, the film starts with a different opening title sequence that does actually have Welles credited as a co-writer of the screenplay adaptation. And then it just starts with the film's story, and you have the introduction of Banat as a normal scene. It's not placed before the titles. So you can't look at this version and say, oh, it's Orson Welles' vision, or it's the director's cut of the film. It's not. It's just an earlier studio work in progress edit, one of seemingly dozens that they kept tweaking and messing with some Mercury involvement in some areas and no Mercury involvement in other areas. So this is a work in progress edit that got sent out and shown in Europe, and it's truly important as it has pieces that are not in the release version, but it's also got a different soundtrack and different credits and a different ending, which is actually part of the climactic sequence with Howard Graham, Colonel Hockey, and Banat out on the awning or the balconies of a hotel in a pounding rainstorm, which is an incredible visual highlight. But essentially the ending that's in the European version is cobbled together from that sequence, and it ends the film abruptly and really does not work and is incredibly unsatisfying. It attempts to end on a very brief, humorous note, like one of Hitchcock's British films, actually. That's what it reminds me of. But it feels really forced because that sequence wasn't designed for it, and that's how that version ends. So that's why that version isn't satisfying, but it's truly important to properly preserve because these materials don't exist otherwise, and it's an earlier edit of the film with unique footage and a completely different sound mix and different credits and everything. But unfortunately, this only exists in a really worn print transfer of some elements that must have been done decades ago. And as far as I know, it only exists on 2 versions in terms of physical media. Most people know it's on an old Spanish Region 2 DVD in the PAL format, so unfortunately it's got speed up. So when you look at this version, the transfer's not great, the audio's not great, but at least it's solid enough. but it's running too fast. So ironically, what should be about 71 minutes is more like 67, 68 minutes. So it's back to the runtime of the US version, but that's just because of the 4% speed up of PAL, so it's running too fast. But the other release is actually the 1980s Japanese Laserdisc that I have here, which is a double feature with Magnificent Ambersons. These are older print scans. They're not the greatest, and they've got hard-coded Japanese subtitles across the bottom, and they only have analog mono audio. But this seems to be the same transfer as that Spanish PAL DVD. So where this transfer was made, what element they used, or how it even got put out on physical media, I don't know. But what's important about this release is that it doesn't have PAL speedup because it's NTSC. But unfortunately, it seems like there's some time compression because there is a little bit of speed up on this. So this isn't the proper speed either. But what's really important is that the analog mono on the Laserdisc doesn't have the heavy noise reduction that the Spanish DVD has. Why is it that every film that Wells was involved in is cursed with problems like these? So if you want to see the incredibly rare alternative edit of the film that was only shown in Europe, you have to either get the Spanish PAL DVD or the Japanese Laserdisc and deal with both of their headaches. But that's all we have for the alternate version. It has never been officially restored or even mentioned whatsoever. The only thing that has been done, some fans have tried to cobble together a version taking footage from both cuts of the film, but you can't really do that because they are completely separate picture and sound edits, as they are two completely different edits. But also, there was the somewhat, I guess you could say, official attempt that was done in Munich and was shown, I believe, at the Museum of Modern Art in 2015. But they were stuck using the same standard def file. I guess probably they were using the Spanish PAL DVD and just, showing their own spiffed up version of that. That's all you can really do, is use this old standard def file. So my hope is that somebody can find this print source and do a proper preservation scan and get that material into a proper vault ASAP, if it even still exists. That's the problem. No one knows if it exists or where it came from or how it got scanned in the first place. Now, for the US release version, the rights are, of course, with Warner Brothers, who have the RKO library. And you would think that with it being linked to Orson Welles and Citizen Kane, that it would have at least gotten some support on physical media and nice official transfers. Of course it didn't. There were some early releases on VHS and Beta in the 1980s, but there were only a couple of those. It was one or two more gray market labels. I actually got a VHS release on the Nostalgia Ventures label. There was an early, I guess it was an RKO release in the early to mid 80s on VHS and Beta, but that's incredibly rare, and it seems like it's also the 68-minute release version. But eventually it did get an official new transfer and official release on Laserdisc and VHS by Turner, and this is the version that has then been put on broadcast on television, primarily on TCM, for all these years since, at least until 2024. So this got a release on Laserdisc, which is a standard Image Entertainment LD with a digital PCM soundtrack, and then it got a very limited release on VHS by Turner as part of the short-lived RKO collection. That VHS is incredibly rare, but it's the same master as the Laserdisc, just in lower resolution. Now, this is a solid enough transfer for the time, but it's a direct element scan. It's got damage, it's got missing frames, but the audio is healthy enough for what it is. But even on a lower res old scan of a print like this, you can still tell the patchwork nature of the film. But that's all we had for years, and these, of course, quickly went out of print. Laserdisc is a dead format, so the only way you could really see the film easily was to catch it on one of its rare TCM airings and tape it. And it was this same master, but reduced in quality because you were catching it on broadcast. And that's been it for the film, and that has, I think, accentuated how obscure it is. So the Warner Archive doing a new Blu-ray release and 4K scan in 2024 for their Blu-ray was so unbelievably welcome. So now to turn to that and talk about the Blu-ray and the quality of the scan and the importance of this release, but also what it has and what it doesn't have, we'll first start with the scan and the picture quality. This is, of course, a standard archive release. It is a brand new 4K preservation scan of the best surviving original elements, which are in the Warner Vault holdings. So this is the 68-minute US release version. It frequently looks stunning on this transfer. This is a phenomenal job by everyone at Warner Motion Picture Imaging and Warner Archive for scanning and handling this scan. When it's coming from original negative materials, this is just jaw-droppingly gorgeous, and particularly the moments that feel lifted right out of the Citizen Kane playbook in terms of the camera angles and the lighting. That's when it just really hits you like a flashing neon sign. Citizen Kane goes to Thriller Land. But unfortunately, this transfer highlights the patchwork nature of the film, because as soon as it goes away from negative materials, when you hit the opticals, when you hit the premature cut or faded scenes, when you go to the reshoots or the dupe materials, there is that quality loss, and you will see it go back and forth all over the place. And that's simply because that's how the film was finished. And by going back to the best surviving original materials, that's just going to get captured in this scan too, and it was even there in the old print scan on the LD. It's just part of the film. So throughout this transfer, you need to expect you're going to see some slight fluctuations in the image. You're going to see the constant generational loss come and go, but you're going to get those amazing moments of high quality when it's original negative material or it's first generation material versus dupes and going down the generational chain. So just go in knowing that the film is a patchwork affair because RKO made it that way. It was not originally that way. Of course, it being an archive disc, the encoding is excellent with a frequently high bit rate, and it certainly should be a frequently high bit rate that's maxed out because this is only a 68-minute film. And unfortunately, the disc is not sharing space with much of anything else. This is a pretty bare bones release. So of course it better have maxed out bitrate, which it does. It's frequently in the 35 up to about 40 megabits per second range, pretty much maxing out what you can get out of a 1080p Blu-ray disc. So that is to the archive same excellent standard. But this is, I think, about as good as anybody could do scanning the 1943 US RKO release edit of the film and doing a good job at making it look as good as possible and not messing with or trying to massage or hide the patchwork nature of the film. And I've never seen it look this good. I think it looks absolutely fantastic. The only issue that's inherent is I do think there are a couple tiny spots where I think there are missing frame or two scattered throughout, and that I think is just another sign of how badly this film was butchered and recut and recut and re-edited and remixed and redubbed and recut again over and over and over. It's pretty much inescapable that you're going to have some missing frames. And the old master on LD and VHS, that had plenty of missing frames. And the European version has plenty of missing frames. So I don't know if any version exists without missing frames somewhere. We then turn to the audio track, which is presented in lossless DTS HDMA 2.0 mono. This is the original mix of the film. It sounds relatively healthy. It has natural hiss in it. And of course, you're going to hear the patchwork nature of all of the audio tomfoolery that went on. When it's sections that seemingly didn't have any changes, that's when it's going to sound its best, but you're going to hear the generational loss. You're going to hear the difference when the Joseph Cotten narration comes in. You're going to hear the slight shifts in quality as it goes along with the edits. So just like the picture, the audio is a patchwork affair. But I think it's, obviously coming from the best surviving original elements, and it actually sounds like the same source element that the Laserdisc used, as they do sound very similar. Of course, the new audio transfer has been cleaned up considerably compared to the old LD, but some of that I think may have been just a little much, as when you listen to this track, it sounds very clear, but it also is louder than the Laserdisc and has a bit less hiss in it. It's a little bit more strident in ways, like the high ends are a bit harsh, especially on louder passages of dialogue. It just sounds a tad modernized in how it's presented, whereas the old Laserdisc PCM is pretty much warts and all and sounds, to my ears, it sounds more natural in spite of having more wear and damage in it. I still think the archive Blu-ray mono sounds great, and it will be fine for most people, but if you want a more completely untouched version of the audio of the US release version, I think it's important to have the Laserdisc. But keep in mind, if you're trying to sync the two audio tracks to match up the Laserdisc mono to the Blu-ray mono, they won't match exactly because the Laserdisc has plenty of missing frames and damage that was cleaned up in this scan. And so you would have to do quite a bit of work to try and synchronize the Laserdisc mono to the Blu-ray mono. So again, I think the Blu-ray mono is healthy. I think it reflects how compromised the source is, just like the picture transfer, but I do have some qualms with it. I wish it had been left alone outside of basic general cleanup, and it does sound a little bit harsh in the high end with a little bit of distortion coming in, especially in the louder music passages for Roy Webb's score. So if I'm comparing the two, if I'm choosing between the two, I do prefer the old Image Laserdisc mono, but again, it's basically picking and choosing between the different transfers of extraordinarily compromised elements. So in terms of packaging and artwork, we just have the standard Warner Archive Blu-ray style, nicely using original poster artwork. So this is from the original one sheet that RKO released. Then we have the standard Warner Archive style spine. And then we have the modern style layout that the Archive division uses for their rear covers, which is a bit more appeasing to modern design sensibilities. It looks solid and it's nicely reflecting some of the colors of the poster used on the front. Of course, we've got some nice publicity stills from the film and the list of the slight extras. And then we nicely have the poster art as the disc label. Now, in terms of the supplements, all you get are 3 classic Mercury radio episode adaptations. They include the famous Mercury version of Dracula that they did for the radio, which is still one of the best adaptations of Bram Stoker's novel ever done. And if you've never heard Orson Welles as Dracula and the Mercury group as the rest of the famous characters, you're doing yourself a disservice. It's a great yearly listen every Halloween. They also include the Mercury's version of A Tale of Two Cities and Treasure Island. All 3 of these were done in 1938, and they're all presented in lossy Dolby Digital 2.0 at 192 kilobits per second in solid quality. Thankfully, most of Wells's radio work is preserved and nicely available in different archive collections, so the preservation quality is a lot higher than, unfortunately, a lot of other Golden Age radio materials. But none of these have anything to do with Journey into Fear or the Mercury Film Unit at RKO, and there's not even an original trailer for the film, which I don't know if they have one that even survives in good enough quality to include here. But there's no extras on here. There's just some of the, well, relatively public domain Mercury radio shows that have been tucked on here. And I guess it was nice enough that the archive to at least put those on here so it wasn't completely bare bones, but this is still bare bones. And this, of all films, just cries out for a deluxe version with both cuts that survive of the film. I do not understand for the life of me why Criterion has never licensed Journey into Fear. This seems tailor-made for them. They did the amazing DVD box set of Mr. Arkadine with the different versions. They, of course, had Kane as their original Laserdisc title and got to finally do the UHD upgrade. Ambersons is another Laserdisc era title that they have reissued on Blu-ray, but they seemingly never thought about touching Journey into Fear, and nor has anyone else. The fact that this doesn't even include the surviving European version, even if they just included the old standard definition file, that is just unforgivable. I know the archive doesn't typically do extras because they have a very limited budget. They focus on the scan work and putting out titles. They're a very small cog in the giant Warner machinery. All that's perfectly fine. But, on bigger and more important releases they handle, they do put some effort in, or they do generate extras, or they do commission a new commentary. And for a film that's this unbelievably historically significant, and a film that is, without question, one of the most butchered films in film history. I mean, in its own little way, it's as butchered as Ambersons was. For there to not even be a commentary track or an inclusion of the old standard definition file that is floating around of the European version, which they should be able to at least go and use that, or mention it, or make a small piece comparing the two versions, which anybody could do in their, just on a computer and editing software, because they own the rights to the film, so they should be able to get, or hopefully source the European version if it still exists, and do a new preservation scan of that. I mean, that's kind of important, to put some effort into the third of only 3 Mercury films at RKO, which is, the sister film of 2 of the most important and most famous films ever made, 2 of the great masterworks of art. To have it just be a bare bones release like this is just it's criminal. It really is. This needs to be properly handled with a deluxe edition that includes both versions of the film, and, possibly a reconstruction using the original shooting script and voice actors and stills, something to try and approximate more of what that original preview version was like. It's understandable why the archive merely released the 68-minute theatrical version. And thank goodness they did, because it is a beautiful preservation scan, and it finally gets the film out in circulation on an affordable, well-made release so people can actually see it. It's been so locked away and kept in a sort of moratorium for so long that most people have never heard of it. I still can't understand why Warner never released the film on DVD here in the US when they finally released Citizen Kane, and of course it took them years to release the Magnificent Ambersons on DVD, which they only did as a sort of bonus side release to the release of Citizen Kane on Blu-ray. So it boggles the mind why they didn't do a big Mercury at RKO package in that DVD heyday that had the 2-disc special edition DVD discs of Citizen Kane, and then a 3rd disc of Ambersons, and a 4th disc of Journey into Fear with some new extras. That would have been a fantastic seller in the heyday of DVD, but you have to have people within the studio who know the catalog and know how to market this stuff. And, it took somebody forever to think of, let's make a bare bones disc of Ambersons and throw it out on DVD and make sure the audio sucks on it. But I guess nobody thought about the poor little sister film that nobody cared about for decades. So it's amazing we even have a modern in-print release that got a new scan. So, all praise and thanks to the Warner Archive for doing this and working with, I believe it's the Library of Congress to produce this scan. But this needed to be a deluxe presentation, like their Curse of Frankenstein release. I mean, it is that important of a film. It's the 3rd of only 3 Orson Welles Mercury Unit RKO films, and it was horrendously butchered, from 100 minutes down to 68 minutes and 2 different, roughly 70-minute versions with different edits and different endings and different credit sequences, and a whole convoluted history that we at least finally have a whole book about. So what I will say is the Warner Archive Blu-ray is one of the most essential and most important discs they have ever done. It is worth its weight in gold, and if you consider yourself a film fan and you have a Blu-ray player, you need to get this disc. But you need to get Mark Edlitz's fantastic book to go along with it to understand how this film got to be so horrendously compromised. This film, if they would let me teach in film schools, I would use this in teaching film editing and film revisionism. I mean, just in teaching editing, you can learn a world of material about what not to do or crazy fixes people might try to deal with a film that others deemed problematic. Because it's not just picture edits, it's intricate sound edits too. And it's so many cooks in the kitchen, and it's just pulling it in so many different directions, resulting in the baffling at times incomprehensible release version, but that still needs to be studied and preserved. This is an unbelievably important film that unfortunately set a precedent that continued for the rest of Welles's career. And you look at what happened on Journey into Fear, and it's impossible to not draw parallels to what happened on his last American film, Touch of Evil, 13 years later. And in both cases, none of it was his fault, but he certainly got blamed for it, and the films were forever compromised. So this is one of those truly important releases that you do have to pick up in conjunction with something else, and that's Mark Edlitz's book, which is worth its weight in gold. He has answered so many of the long-standing mysteries about the film and detailed the entire production process and the unbelievably messed up post-production process and a basic blow-by-blow accounting that anybody can follow along and understand. And as you read along, you just become increasingly baffled, mystified, horrified, and bewildered at what this poor film went through. So Edlitz's book really takes the place of the commentary tracks, the critical pieces, the featurettes, the plethora of supplements that any Orson Welles Mercury film should have, but doesn't because it's just a bare bones release of the 68-minute US theatrical version. So you really need to check out Edlitz's book if you want to know more about this film, or if you're new to it and you watch this film and you are just confused as to what the heck you're seeing. Because when you see this film for the first time and you don't know anything about it, you are going to be scratching your head so hard that you won't be able to think about anything else after the film ends because you're just going to be so bewildered. So I'm really thankful we now have an entire book about Journey into Fear to have as a supplement to the film that finally debunks all of the silly urban legends, that rightfully focuses on Norman Foster's contributions and that he was indeed the director. It also highlights the collaborative efforts of all of the Mercury unit and how Welles's style is in the film, but Foster's style is in the film, but Joseph Cotten's style is in the film. All this stuff is in there. And it would have made for an interesting, striking film that would have been a classic in its own right, but it unfortunately never got to be completed. I would also encourage people to check out Eric Ambler's amazing original source novel from 1940. Ambler is one of the great thriller writers of the 20th century. Heck, I'll just say he's one of the great writers of the 20th century. His influence on spy fiction and thrillers is incalculably immense. I mean, he influenced everyone, including Ian Fleming, obviously, and also even John le Carre. I mean, practically everyone is following in the footsteps of Ambler. But the film very much replicates a lot of the feeling of his original novel, and so if you have any questions about the convoluted story and the film being so jumbled doesn't obviously answer those for you, Ambler's novel is an incredible read, and I highly recommend it. So those are my thoughts on Journey into Fear on the Warner Archive Blu-ray. This is a film that I have been fascinated with since the first time I finally got to see it, which was, like most people, I got to see it on a TCM airing that I tried to tape on VHS using the family VCR, and I would return to it every once in a while, and it always baffled the heck out of me, but I started to put two and two together and see occasional mentions in Welles biographies about it being a troubled production, but there wasn't a whole lot of information. We didn't get a Robert Carringer book about the making of Journey into Fear like his books on Kane and Ambersons. But we finally do have that in Mark Edlitz's book, so it's really wonderful for people coming to the film now that you can actually know more and be looking at such a beautiful 4K preservation scan of the 68-minute version. As before the 2024 Blu-ray, you had to do what I did and track down the old image laserdisc or get the even rarer VHS tape, or go down further in terms of the rabbit hole and get a copy of the European version, which is only on an obscure Japanese laserdisc and a Spanish PAL DVD that's long out of print, and both of those have speed up and time compression issues. So, this is a film that still has not had the perfected release it deserves. It screams it cries out for a definitive boutique label deluxe presentation. It so badly needs that alternate European version to get a proper high-resolution modern preservation scan, and for somebody to lock down those elements and get them properly in a vault preserved alongside the US version elements. And hopefully, at some point, somebody can turn up at least some bits of original material. This is actually a sister case to the Holy Grail of finding the lost original version of Ambersons, because, as Edlitz highlights in his book, Journey into Fear was destroyed alongside the Ambersons material. In terms of the original material for the 100-minute preview version and all the other bits and bobs, that was destroyed along with Ambersons. The RKO held on to the Ambersons material until the release is finished, and they also held on to Journey into Fear because of all the editing and reshoots and the double billing, programming, and things, and they basically held on to all of this stuff for both of the films because they were budgeted together, and apparently they destroyed all of them at the same time. So that's, of course, beyond soul-crushing and heartbreaking, but it also puts Journey into Fear in the same situation as Ambersons. This is a lost film, just like Ambersons was. And in terms of percentage of footage hacked out and removed or replaced, it's technically right up there with Ambersons. It's just as it's actually more compromised in its storytelling than Ambersons, because, and at least in Ambersons, in the 88-minute version, you can still follow the story. You cannot follow the story of Journey into Fear in the 68-minute version 100%. You still have to make leaps of logic, and you're still going to get confused. Even if you've seen the film 10 or 20 times, it can still be confusing. So this is one of the most compromised, butchered films in film history. It has still not had a definitive restoration. It still doesn't have a definitive physical media release. Why no one has tried to at least include both versions of the film that survive is beyond me, but in my opinion, this should be, top of the list for any label to attempt doing a definitive story of the making of the compromised third Orson Welles Mercury Group RKO film. I don't know why no one has ever done it or even seemingly thought of doing it. But at least we have the Warner Archive Blu-ray. It's well made. The scan and picture master is fantastic, and it is dirt cheap. It's one of the most essential Blu-rays you can get for your collection. Everyone with a Blu-ray player who loves Orson Welles or loves Citizen Kane needs a copy of this. And also, I would say picking up Mark Edlitz's book is essential, because it is the incredible supplemental package this film needs. And without his book, you don't have all of that absolute wealth of knowledge and background to understand what this crazy film is you're looking at, because it was so horrendously butchered. So that's the Warner Archive Blu-ray, easily one of the most important releases they've ever done. Arguably, there is a case to say that it is the most important release they've ever done, because it's a brand new, beautiful preservation scan of a film that has been not available since 1990, 1991 on the old print scan. But it is severely lacking in terms of being a bare bones release. I mean, this needs to be licensed out and be given a full, complete restoration of both versions, and have just multiple discs of extras made, because you could make an entire documentary about the making of this film and still not scratch the surface. I mean, you really need to basically just put out both cuts of the film along with another copy of Mark Edlitz's book. That's how intensive his book is, and why his book is so incredibly important. But this is a film that has been too obscure for too long. It really needs proper rediscovery, and at least we finally have a fantastic version for people to look at, but it's only the unbelievably compromised US release version. You still have to track down your own copy of the European cut, and it's unfortunately very low quality and not at the correct speed. So as always, I hope my babblings about classic films, the works of Orson Welles and the Mercury Group, the works of Norman Foster, and physical media releases have been at least somewhat fun and informative. This is one of the most essential Warner Archive discs they have ever put out. Again, if you have a Blu-ray player and you love classic films and you love Citizen Kane, you need this. But it's just a shame that the archive doesn't do extras, as this film needs supplemental features so badly, because without them, you won't understand what it is you're looking at and how it got to be so completely wacky in its presentation and editing. This is one of the most unbelievably butchered films in film history. In its own way, it is as compromised as the Magnificent Ambersons and shares the same tragic fate. It is, for me, another of the absolute holy grails of film archiving, in terms of hopefully finding original materials and elements or a longer edit of the film at some point. But just like Ambersons, that's probably never going to happen, because the original materials were actually destroyed with the Ambersons materials by RKO. So definitely get a copy of the Warner Archive Blu-ray if you haven't. It is unbelievably essential, but do pair it at least with Mark Edlund's incredible research volume, Maverick and the Machine. I'll have links to everything in the description below, and I would also again encourage people to read Eric Ambler's amazing original novel. Please do keep supporting both studios and boutique labels by buying films on disc in order to help keep both physical media and film culture alive, and as always, thank you ever so much for watching.